Let's talk about CVs and boots. If you weren't confused before, you probably will be now, because all CVs have a various number of boots, and we're going to go through all of them. But the one axle assembly you find in off-road cars, and especially Volkswagen-powered cars, are also swing axles. Swing axles don't use CVs, but they do use boots. And there's two types of swing axle boots. One is where you take the axle assembly apart, you slip this on, and the other is what we call a repair boot, where you rip it. You don't have to take it apart because it's difficult, and you just put the repair boot on there. So that's really simple for a swing axle. Okay. Now let's talk about the Type 1, Type 2 style. So your Type 1, Type 2 style usually use the same type of a boot. You can use a standard flange, or more popular is the flange and boot assembly, where it has a boot and a flange already assembled. The axle goes through here, comes out. This bolts to the CV. It has a flange that holds the balls in the CV. And you can see with something like this, there's not a lot of room for up and down motion in there because of this captive piece. But for a Type 1 and Type 2, that's really all you need. So this type works really well. It's inexpensive. It usually comes with bolts, and you're done. Now, the 930. Probably one of the most popular CVs out there is the 930. And the 930 can have a varying number of boots. But the first thing you have to know is there are boot flanges. So on the CV, it'll either bolt through the flange to the axle, to the hub. The axle will go through and it'll go to the hub, or it'll go to the transmission side, and it's going to bolt on with a bolt. Most often they are 12 points, sometimes they're Allen bolts. And what this flange will do is it'll hold the CV together as the axle does what we call plunging. And if without that there, the CV would come apart when the angle was put on it. And you can see that takes quite a bit of room to do that. That holds a boot that is most commonly this type of a boot that will go on top of it. And this boot is very nice. It has a lot of movement. They're light. We use a really high quality boot. The second style boot, very similar, is this style boot, which is more of a tapered boot. Sometimes when you don't have a lot of room around your CV, especially in the axle side, you'll use a tapered boot. Those are two popular boots for the 930, but we're not done. If your 930 has a different flange, we call an overall boot flange, then this flange will hold a different type of boot. The most popular type of boot is what we call the overboot, which actually, if you look at the boot itself, inside there's a ridge. The boot will go over this flange, and it'll be an overboot, and the bolts won't be exposed. And one thing I didn't mention on here, when this one is here, the bolts are exposed. Let me grab another example of that. I should have one here. Here we go. If I use this, when you tighten the bolts on, and we're going to talk about how to actually do this, when you tighten the bolts on, the bolts are exposed. You can see if the bolts come loose. You can use a little bit of a paint marker to make sure they don't move. You can wire tie them together. It's easy to service the CV because the bolts are easy. If you want to, though, usually to re-grease the CV, what you're going to end up doing is taking the bolts out to do that, because you're generally going to use some type of a boot flange clamp like this, where it's not reusable. There are reusable ones, but they tend to be harder to get on a lot of the flanges. So the flange size will determine that. If your flange size is bigger, it's easier to put a standard worm gear type clamp on there, but then your axle, as it pivots, when you have droop and compression on your car, it's probably going to hit. That's why these are designed not to do that. Okay, so if you have the other type of flange, which is your standard boot flange, as I was showing you, you have a couple choices there. One is you can use an overboot like this that goes over the boot flange. So in this case, it would be like this, an overboot that goes there. You can use what's called a short boot, which also goes on there. Again, this one is an overboot. It's longer, allows for a little bit more angularity. This is a shorter boot if you have a room constraint. Again, this goes over that. And then, because that's not difficult enough, you can also have an assembly, and there are various types like this. It's what we call a double boot, where you have an internal boot and then an over boot over the top. This can be really good if you're in a place like Baja, for instance, or even people with woods buggies have this, where you might rip that boot. And if you rip the boot, because the axle is assembled, you have to take the whole car apart to fix it. So a lot of times if you rip that boot, the internal boot will protect it and you'll be safe. So a dual boot arrangement is really nice. There's a couple different types. When we get into 934s, I'll show you that. So that's your general 930 boot arrangement. Pretty clear, pretty easy. Let's go to 934, 935. Now I mentioned 934s and 935s are basically the same CV with a different star. So you have a lot of different ways of doing this. The most popular is a single boot, similar type of flange as a 930, single boot. There we go. Nice and easy, done, single boot arrangement. Some people will take that single boot and they won't even use the difficult flange. They'll just put an over boot over the top of it. Do I recommend that? Not necessarily, but it's been done and it's been done many times. The reason a lot of people want to run a small boot on there is to contain the grease. When you run very high speed, it's possible that you can throw grease from the CV, but I will tell you that if you're using the right grease, you probably won't have that problem. Okay, we talked about overboot like this, standard overboot flange, just like you have with a 930. Pretty simple. This same flange is the one that we showed you here that you can use that with, and that will work really effectively. One other thing that some people have is they happen to have a flange. This would be on the type of a boot, would be used on what we call a midboard, and the midboard would have its own flange that would hold that boot. In most cases, they're either going to put another boot over the top or they're going to use a leather boot with it. A lot of times they'll use a leather boot. I don't have one here right now on the table, so I can't show you a leather boot, but think of a leather boot being a boot that goes over it. Now, one of the things that we always suggest is whenever you do any type of boot, especially an outer boot, that you use a graphite lubricant on these. So if you're in a sand condition or a dirt condition, these will often be touching. When you're standing still, they'll be like this. When you're drooping, they're going to be like this. And if you just use a little dry lubricant on there, which is either graphite powder or you can buy graphite spray, clean your boot, use a graphite spray, you'll usually get a lot more life out of your boot. I want to mention one last thing we get a million questions about. It's something called a seal saver, or we call it a CV leather. This happens to be a Gear 1 version. I think it's the best one on the market. It uses a leather insulator, and what it does is it is a flange that sits on top of your CV, allows the axle to go through, and it bends for that, but it keeps the grease in. In conditions where up on the transmission side of the car, where you're experiencing a lot of heat and you're not running any type of ventilated CV, you're starting to see the grease start to come out, not attain stiction into your CV. These can be very helpful. The leather can be replaced, but they do add additional heat to the CV. So you have to be careful how you use them, but they're a great addition.